Welcome to the show, everyone. This is the Voices of Healing podcast. I'm your host, Tina Clark. Today's guest is Bree Anderson. She's a soul guide and a trauma resolution healer. And she's going to share with us today her own healing experience from medical surgical trauma and multiple surgeries. So welcome to the show, Bree.
Thank you so much, Tina. I'm excited to be here. It's an honor, so thank you.
So tell us a little bit more about yourself, and then you can start with your story.
Yeah, so it's hard. My story starts so young, so it's kind of natural for me to start there. But yeah, I'm a California native. Been here my whole life in Southern California. I have my own private practice where I help people resolve trauma. I started off as an energy healer, had a background in psychology and did art therapy, and did really beautiful work. I've had my private practice for over 15 years. And along my journey, I, you know, was healing, but then it wasn't completely healing everything. So I kept studying different modalities. And in 2017, I started getting into body-based somatic trauma resolution. And so now I offer kind of a weave and a blend of all of that. So, yeah.
So I'm a little familiar with somatic healing, but can you, in case listeners don't know what that means, can you explain what that is?
Yeah, beautiful question. So somatic, right? The prefix of the word soma means body. So when you hear somatic, um, it's referencing that it's body based. So and there's a lot of different ways that people are using that word as a title, right? You'll hear somatic coaches or somatic tantra healers. I am a somatic experiencing practitioner. So that is was a 3-year program where I learned, like a whole way of how trauma affects people from like being in utero or birth, right? What's like if somebody's born with a cord wrapped around their neck and how they can be affected by that, all the way to like, natural disasters, and the typical big T traumas that people talk about, right? Like rapes and sexual trauma and physical assaults and all of that. But it goes all the way into developmental trauma and complex PTSD. So some people have a really detailed ability to work with the body with somatic, and then some people have a more general, and somatic experiencing is a very in-depth, very science-based, nervous system-based method. And I found it incredibly healing for me and enlightening on and being able to understand what's going on with not just my clients, but everyday people around me, because you can't separate our body from anything that we do. So, yeah.
So does everybody experience um, feelings in their body, or does it vary according to the person?
Oh, it varies according to the person, for sure. I have a client, and when we say feelings, right, people generally tend to think of emotions. And so there's also sensations, and those coincide and they go together. Like when you get angry, your body gets hot and warm, and sometimes it starts to feel kind of speedy or racy inside. And people might be more aware of the emotion, but not aware of exactly the sensation and how the energy is coursing and moving through the nervous system and moving through the body. But yeah, depending on somebody's history and what they've experienced from traumas to the general family dynamics that they grew up in, or their own natural tendencies. So people who are have younger traumas, especially pre and perinatal or birth traumas, they are a little bit more disconnected from their physical body. They're a little bit more heady, and so there tends to be more of a disconnect. There's some people who, when they go through certain traumas again, they completely kind of unhook themselves from their emotional center. And so they go through life kind of feeling numb and not really feeling a lot of emotions. So yeah, there's a complete array, and it just depends on somebody's epigenetics, like their genealogical lineage and how their genes are predisposed, what they experienced in their family dynamics growing up, and then what traumas they specifically had. So that, you know, makes us each unique and different and
Yeah,
beautiful things, and through
I
our
guess it comes down to how well can have you numbed yourself,
mm-hmm,
from your feelings. And I always look at the body as like a pendulum.
how
If you
so?
have,
Tell me
have you
more.
ever worked with a pendulum before?
Yeah, I
Okay.
actually, yeah.
So I know people, I've experienced people, Reiki students, clients whose bodies respond to words, um, thoughts, feelings. When you're talking to someone and they get the goosebumps up and down their
Mhm.
body.
Yes, yes, yes.
And I always tell people, because, I get pretty frank with my conversations with clients and students, just
Mhm,
tell them the truth and how I experience life and why I think we're here. When you talk about this big topic, sometimes people respond and they say, "Oh, I just got goosebumps all over my body." And I say, that's because you're hearing the truth
mhm,
and
mhm,
your body is responding to it.
mhm,
So it's telling you this is the truth.
mhm. I call them truth bumps.
And then on the other hand, if you hear a lie, like I've kind of hardwired this way, but since a child, but I knew when someone was lying
Mhm,
to me. Even people on TV, I would be like, they're lying. But I feel physically uncomfortable when someone is not being honest.
mhm,
I
mhm,
feel it kind of in the belly area, but I just don't feel comfortable. It's just a discomfort. So then I know they're not being entirely truthful with me right now.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, familiar with that sensation as well.
So a pendulum responds to energy. So you could use it to ask your own questions if you know what your yes, no, and maybe movements are on the pendulum. Or, I use it in Reiki to look at people's chakras because I can show them how their chakras are moving with the pendulum.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
I've used it that way. But yeah, the pendulum responds to the body, but the body is also a pendulum.
Love it. Beautiful.
So why don't you tell us about your own struggles with your health? And obviously you were able to overcome them now through all your work on yourself, all the modalities you learned. So tell us what happened to you.
Yeah, yeah. So I was born with bilateral hip dysplasia, which means that both of my hips were dislocated when I was born, meaning the my leg bones were not in the right position that they're supposed to be in. And the leg bone connects to the hip with like a socket, and it's a ball and socket joint. But when we're born, our bones aren't fully hardened until we're 5. The baby's head, they have that soft spot on the top of their head. So the hip socket, it's actually like kind of just a shelf. It's like a little line, shall we say? It's flat, and so it forms by the weight of the upper body as the little being starts walking, and the support of gravity. And so I started walking, and my leg bones are behind my pelvis in the wrong spot. So I was walking a little funky. My parents took me to my pediatrician, and he was like, "Oh, it's her back. She'll grow out of it," right? Growing insinuates time. And so I wasn't growing out of it, I was growing into it. And my parents bought a house. They switched their PPO insurance down to HMO. And at 3.5, I've been walking for 2.5 years by that point. Um, the doctor looked at me and looked at my parents and said, she has bilateral hip dysplasia. I interned with children with hip dysplasia. We're going to, expedite her and get her into surgery as soon as possible. So 3 weeks later, I had my very first surgery. And, 3.5, I got no idea what's going on. And I don't remember that first surgery or the first few, shall we say. So they did one on my right side. 3 weeks later, they wheel me back in. I'm in the full body cast, right? And a full body cast is like from like your toes all the way to your ribs. And there's a bar between my legs and a hole cut out so I can, go to the bathroom. So I'm like trapped in this cast, right? So they put me under, they saw off the cast, they assess my right hip before they do the left one, and my right hip had fallen out and was back where it was originally. So they do the left one, I come out a full body cast, right? And 6 months later, I've got to go back and redo the right hip. Well, this was a process that lasted until I was 11. I had 10 major reconstructive hip surgeries. Both hips didn't take very well. My right hip had 6 surgeries, my left had 4. So in that like 8.5 year window, I spent almost 6 years, if you were to put all the time in the cast consecutively, in a full body cast, which is like, it's crazy to think of now, that's like more than half of the first decade of my life. I was in a full body cast. So anyway, after that, my parents divorced, and I had other traumas that happened, right? They divorced. It was nasty. I was put in the middle. That was drawn out for many, many years. And later I got into drugs and had my daughter at 19, and luckily she's the light of my life, the most amazing human. And I kind of started my healing journey, actively started it from there. So it's kind of a brief overview. But having those surgeries and the amount of physical trauma, right? Surgeries, when they're repetitive, through the lens of somatic experiencing, they categorize it as ritual abuse because surgeries are very ritual in nature, right? I mean, even from pre-op, they draw your blood, right? You go in, they give you an IV, you get wheeled in, they put you under, and there's a protocol that they go through to do these surgeries. So even though we have the beautiful technology or medicine of anesthesia, my consciousness was, not experiencing the trauma, even though I was out of my body, completely disconnected, completely dissociated, thank the Lord. But my body had a completely different experience. And for many people, when you're put under general anesthesia, you're intubated, meaning you're having a machine breathe for you, and your body's strapped down to the table as they do these procedures, right? So I'm just having a moment where I'm realizing I'm talking about this super in depth, and people listening who've had traumas, this might be kind of triggering, right? So I'm just going to take a little pause in case there's anybody that has that happen. Is having that happen. So because of the nature of this, I was completely and utterly changed. I had massive amounts of depression, massive amounts of shame. My body was never going to work like anybody else's. I had chronic pain, and I mean, I felt like the Hunchback of Notre Dame, right? Like he was like the rejected, ugly creature that couldn't stand up straight and walked kind of funny. I mean, that was me, and that was my entire elementary school, middle school, high school. And so the trauma, as I'm developing, continued to bleed into other areas and realms of my life. So it affected me socially, right? It affected, I would go out into the world and, you know, people would look at me a certain way and they'd look away, right? Because there's this like thing, like, don't stare, like, don't look. And I felt like there's something so wrong with me. People can't even look at me, like, they can't even acknowledge me. So it created a massive identity issue. Uh, and not just, obviously my relationship to my body was like horrendous. um, so yeah, so that was my experience with medical surgical trauma. Um, and the younger a human is when they have any trauma, the more adversely it's going to affect them, affect their mind, their body, their spirit, because we're still developing. Our psychology is still developing, our nervous system is still developing. So in medical surgical trauma, just as a whole, there tends to be some really unusual or unexplained symptoms that people can have after. So one of those, like, people could be, they could have a hard time falling asleep. So they might lay down, and this could be someone who has one surgery and they're maybe 35 when they have the surgery, but afterwards they have a hard time falling asleep because of the process of the anesthesia. So they might fall asleep and then suddenly jolt awake and have all this anxiety and not know what's happening. They can have weird breathing issues after. Um, and then just weird, unexplained like sensations or pains in their body. So those are kind of the common ones, but there's a whole slew of things because of how intricate um, medical surgical procedures are. So I could talk on and on and on about this. And do you have any questions?
Well, it's interesting that you talked about them having a hard time falling asleep because I'm thinking about the root chakra, and the root chakra is feeling safe
Mhm.
and feeling safe in your body. And so that's what, they're experiencing to me is, they don't feel safe, or they don't feel safe to be unconscious because while they were unconscious, they had things done to their body,
Exactly.
which the
Exactly.
body remembers.
The body remembers whether we want it to or not. And it lets us know that it's remembering. But yes, that's exactly what it is. The body and the being, right, doesn't feel safe being unconscious. And so it gets
Mhm.
triggered as they're falling asleep. And, because the nature of surgeries in general, right? Some procedures people are not fully put under general anesthesia. They might have local anesthesia, which is, they might numb just a specific area, like dental work is local anesthesia. Um, um, what was I going to say? The anesthesia in general is very, very dissociative, right? It's a dissociative agent.
Mhm.
And so there is and can be a lot of um, people feeling out of body and just not feeling connected to their body. So definitely can cause a lot of root chakra issues or, tendencies, symptoms, all of that.
Okay, so you went through all of this during your childhood, and so how did you end up overcoming it or healing it? What
Yeah,
was your process?
yeah, great question. Well, it was a really long process, and it's funny when I look back. I explained that I had all this family trauma after. So generally, as we heal, we kind of address what's most present, right? And oftentimes, what's kind of not the root, like what's the layer over, right? The most up layer. And so in my 20s, I was working through a lot of family issues. But during that period of time, I, I had a lot of shame, a lot of anger, a lot of stuff like that. And so I first went to school for psychology, and I had seen some talk therapists that weren't really, like, it was good to talk. It was good to have awarenesses, but it wasn't changing how I was feeling inside, and the circumstances of my life were not changing either. So, as much as I believed in psychology and the science, I veered away from it. Well, not away from it. I simultaneously studied it while I went to a 4-year energy healing school. And that was really, really profound for me, doing the energy healing work. I also went to a soul center for spiritual healing, and I'm not a shaman, but I got into things like field clearing, and I did karmic releases and emotional impactings to the soul. And this was very profound because it kind of lifted the heaviness and the density of, um, the impact, the compounding and the impact of all the trauma that I had experienced at that time, right? Or through my life up until that time in my early to mid 20s. And so I opened my private practice, and I was doing really beautiful work. And, as healing happens, we heal in themes and layers. And I'd worked through a lot of stuff and was feeling great. And then the next kind of layer started to emerge and arise. And so, medical surgical traumas, right, especially in childhood, they're often, they often occur while you're laying down flat on your back. So when we have certain traumas that our body is in a particular position, our body's more vulnerable to traumas or similar or other traumas where that body could be in the same position. So that actually predisposed me towards sexual trauma. And so I had some sexual trauma, and I started realizing in my later 20s, early 30s, like, I'm the common denominator here, like, and that was like really not fun to sit with. And so I, do what I do, which is try and figure out how to heal. And I saw a therapist, I saw a sex therapist, and I was with this sex therapist, and I was asking her, like, this is the issue. This is what keeps happening. I get myself into these, well, sometimes I would get myself into these situations, but then I'd have other situations, but I wasn't dissociating, right? So I didn't think it was like sexual trauma, but I would freeze, right? And anesthesia creates massive amounts of freeze in the body. And so I wasn't able to have the agency to really show up as my sexual self, right? I wasn't able to be directive or ask for what I wanted or say, yeah, that's not working for me. I just was like kind of mute and frozen, which, is a horrible experience. Like, it's so horrible. Um, so that's what I was working on it. And the therapist was like, well, you have great boundaries with your daughter and with work. I'm like, I know, but in this area, I don't. So what's the treatment plan? She had no treatment plan. So I'm like, okay, like, I need to take this into my own hands, right? So I went to, after doing my research and all of that, I signed up for a tantric program, the tantric coaching program, and it was like a year long, and there was some aspects to it that were so beautiful and so lovely and so healing, and simultaneously there were other aspects that were not. And so what happened is it started bringing all of my trauma to the surface. And at this point in time, I didn't realize this is the part that makes me laugh. I didn't realize the core of my trauma was my surgeries, right? Like, I had had them my whole life. I'd gotten accustomed to it. I didn't know any different, right? So I didn't realize, like, damn, this is like the core of it, right? So anyway, halfway through that program, I had all of these symptoms that were like roaring in my face that I'd had periodically throughout my life. Like, I was in chronic pain. I was so tired. and had like no energy to do anything. Um, and I was like constantly irritated, like just like constantly irritated by things, and then was dealing with depression. So very strong trauma symptoms. So I'm like, this program's great. I'm going to keep going at a pace that's proper for me, but I need something outside of this program. And this is where I found somatic experiencing. And it was so beautiful for me to go through this process of healing in a way that was very mind, body, spirit oriented, but very much through the body. And it impacted me so profoundly that I chose to study somatic experiencing. And actually studied a couple other forms of somatic work and body-based healing, because somatic experiencing, as lovely it is, it's very sciencey, and I needed like the spiritual component too. So I was looking for things that was very mind, body, spirit. And so I did things that I didn't know were even possible for healing. And like, for instance, with any type of, with a lot of traumas, there's boundary ruptures, right? And, but with any type of body trauma, um, a rape, a physical attack, even a car accident, right? There's ruptures to our physical boundaries, but that also can um, overspan or move into, emotional boundaries and other forms of boundaries, right? Because our body's kind of one, it's just so personal, right? So I did some really profound boundary repair work, and part of my soul and my spirit started to come back and come back online. And I had more agency, and I was able to really, for the first time in my life, really blossom into who I was, and have boundaries and have agency and speak my mind. And my yeses were my yeses and my nos were my nos. And I was able to live so much more congruently. Um, that was obviously, that's very profound. So yeah, that's, kind of a overview of my healing. But I found breath work in the tantric program, and so I studied a somatic based, just biodynamic form of trauma resolution breath work. Also studied yamana body rolling. Um, I tell everybody it's like yoga, but with balls. It's not really, but it's kind of gives you a visual. And so that actually really helped with the chronic pain that I had in my body and in my joints, which wasn't just in my hips. It was all in my spine and my neck, and luckily not my knees, thank the Lord, or my shoulders. So, but yeah, so that's kind of a little brief overview.
So how are you doing today? Like, have your how are your hips today? Were they ever fixed from the surgeries, or what's happening with you now?
So, great question. Because of the extensiveness, my right leg is almost an inch shorter than my left leg. And is that from my femur? Is that based on how they were kind of like cutting my hip bones, or my acetabulums even? I don't know exactly. I could go and spend thousands of dollars and find out through X-rays if they do them standing up, right? Because they do them laying down, and laying down is very different. So I will always have a tendency towards becoming structurally unbalanced. Um, and for me, I feel like it's a gift, because it shows me when I'm more aligned, like spiritually, emotionally, like just in my life, right, with the choices I'm making. And then when I'm not, like, I tend to get a little bit more imbalanced. So when I'm imbalanced, I will have some pain, right? I will feel uh, like my hips are tighter. But for the most part, my hips don't hurt, like and it's like, makes me emotional to say this, because this is what I, as a child and as a teenager and a young adult, like I believed wholeheartedly that I could get to the other side. And I've done it, you know, so it's really, really exciting. And, you know, I'm here doing this because I know how possible healing is. And I want people to know that it's possible. It might take a long time. You might have to keep trying different modalities and seeing different people, but it is possible if you're willing and don't give up and you believe. So I do have a little pain in my back and in my neck. And so I'm seeing a person that's helping me with that right now. She is a very gifted healer. I drive an hour to see her. But she's a physical therapist and a body worker and very spiritual. And she's helped me to, like, I actually saw her a week or two ago. I see her once a month because I don't need to very frequently. But I had this chronic pain in my neck. And in the session, as she was working on me, I literally felt it kind of like, and this is like, I felt it as energy. Like some sessions are like this, some not, but I felt it like, you know, I'm laying on my back. I felt it dislodge out of my neck and like ripple down the backside of my body and then expand out. And it was like this beautiful webbing of gauze. And it has not been back, you know, so that part completely released and let go. So, that's super exciting for me. And I love healing and I love the process and I'm always curious, you know, what's going to happen in this session. But yeah, you know, and just to add a little bit more on how trauma affects people, right? Like, and to use my story, I'm laying down on the table, right? And when we go through traumatic experiences, our breathing changes, right? Our body braces, we freeze, we have sympathetic activation. Parts of us want to run out of the room, parts of us want to fight back, and then parts of us like freeze, right? So we have all these things happening at once. And the body, that's not this trauma isn't just in the nervous system, right? It's in all the cells of the tissue, it's in our auric fields. But our joints compress, right, as a way to protect ourselves. Trauma it gets stuck in our organs, right? People who have anger, right, like maybe a boy who was you know, he had an alcoholic dad. I use this example all the time, but let's say he had an alcoholic dad that was like screaming at him. He would have an impulse. One of his impulses inside would be to like yell back at him, right? But he would stop that impulse and that anger would get thwarted and offset the balance of his liver because the liver, as you probably know, relates to and it houses anger, right?
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I just find the body and humans and God's creation of us, right, to just be so exquisite and marvelous in our ability to survive, you know, threats, right? Life-threatening situations or perceived threatening situations. And I think it's just miraculous how our body responds to it. Unfortunately, we get stuck in it, right? And we don't always know how to move through it. But there's a way. And if we can move into something, we can move out of something, you know? So,
Yeah, I think the key to your story is you never gave up and you're still working on it and you're still learning different things and that's why you're so much better.
that's 100% the key. I didn't give up and I believed that it was possible to get to where I am. And there's, you know, my right hip had more surgery, so there's more scar tissue. But there's range of motion that I still believe my hips can go into. And so that's why I keep seeing this body worker because I'm like, how far can my body go? Right. The limp and the gait that I had when I was younger was so severe that everybody would always ask me, what's wrong with your leg? What's wrong with your ankle? Like, why do you walk that way? And I don't know the last time somebody has asked me that. If I get tired or I'm in pain, then obviously it shows a little bit more. But it's really cool to be in a place where for months people wouldn't know unless they saw me in a bathing suit, and they saw my scars. So yeah.
That's great.
Mhm.
So, if you wanted to learn about somatic experiencing, like I'm interested in it, are there any books you recommend or where can we find out more?
Absolutely. So the creator of somatic experiencing, his name is Peter Levine, and his intro book is called Waking the Tiger. And that's a very good kind of entry level for understanding trauma in a very general sense. For people who are more scientific in their minds or have a strong psychology background, I would recommend his uh, last book, which is called In an Unspoken Voice. I forget the I don't know, how to heal trauma and restore goodness, I think, something like that. But that is like kind of, he's in his 80s now. I mean, that book is, I don't know, probably around five years out. I don't think it's been 10 years. But it's a very book that you read in small chunks. But it really, really gives you a good understanding of how trauma um, gets stuck inside of somebody and how somatic experiencing trauma resolution work is done.
Yeah,
So,
I'm so interested in this because I look at it from an energy standpoint.
mhm.
So I know the seven chakras very, very well. And so if I have a client come in and say, I'm having problems with sore throats, that's an obvious one. That's the
Yeah,
throat
totally,
chakra.
for
So I
sure.
start asking them a bunch of questions like, can you speak your truth? Is there somebody you're struggling with that you can't speak to, but you want to? Are you holding back your words?
Hmm,
And
hmm,
usually somebody will come up with someone that's challenging them in that way.
hmm. Right, right. Yeah. I started off as an energy healer, and um, part of why I got into this was my own journey, right? But the other part is that I noticed that the work that I was doing only went so far. And so I was like, I know that people can go further in their healing, but I can feel it, but I didn't know what to do, right? I didn't, I like use all my tools, right?
Hmm.
So, and a lot of people come in for energy based symptoms, right? Like they're anxious and they feel like it's like their energy, right? And what I learned is that the energy field, as it interfaces with our body, right? The strongest system that it's most deeply connected to is the nervous system. And then it interfaces with the endocrine system. So from my lens now, with everything I've studied, they're one and the same to me. Like the energy field and the nervous system is one and the same. Like when somebody gets nervous, right? And their heart rate goes up and they start feeling shaky. They're feeling that in their physiology, right, of their body, but that's simultaneously showing up in the energy field at the same time. So it's become a blend for me, but
Yeah, it might be ironic to say this, but I feel like we know very little about the body.
yeah, yeah,
And I
I would
think
say
it's
so
because
for
we've
sure.
looked, science has looked at the body and kind of separated into these different parts that we're not connected and we're not used to paying attention to the body and how the body responds. We tend to focus on the mind and the thoughts and ignore everything else.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And so, yeah, this is kind of like uncharted territory now
Mhm,
to
mhm.
really understand our bodies and why they're responding and what they're trying to communicate to us.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I definitely think it's like new cutting edge, the cutting edge of healing that's on the planet right now, our, growing up here in the West, right? And the way that our medical system is, it is about separation, right? Like I'm going to go to a urologist or I'm going to go to this doctor, which can be helpful, right? But as a whole, Western society has separated the body from the mind. And in Eastern culture, it is much more integrated. Chinese medicine is actually one of my most revered forms of medicine because of how, I mean, it's been around for 5,000 years, but they they knew like that, just how the organs were connected to the spirit and the psychology and the body. Like it's beautiful if you ever study it. I took 300 hours, and the school I was going to closed down, so a little sad I didn't get to study that all the way and wasn't going to go full on to an acupuncture school. But yeah, Eastern medicine is a little bit ahead of the game, I would say, on this. But yeah, I think for the most part, Western culture is very disconnected from the body,
Mhm.
and we value intellect and intellectual ways of being. You go south of the border into Latin, Spanish speaking countries, and they're much more connected emotionally in the way that they engage with people, right? So different cultures
Mhm.
have different flavors to them and all
Yeah,
the other.
you can feel it. I mean, I spent 9 days in Mexico looking at sacred sites, and I loved it because I really felt the heart energy in Mexico. And then in here in the US, it's all in the head.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
everything's mental,
Mhm, mhm.
and to
Yeah,
go to a heart-centered place is such a relief.
I know, I know.
It really is. You're like, oh, this feels good. You
Yeah.
can't even pinpoint it. Like you can't even describe it. And I don't even know where it's coming from.
Mhm,
Is it the
mhm.
indigenous blood of the Mexican people that's coming through? Like I don't know what it is, but it definitely feels different and better to me.
Yeah, yeah. And definitely, I mean, historically, like Spain has kind of infiltrated Mexico and South, right? Um, so there's definitely the blend of the indigenous people and the Latin blood, right? Mixing
Mhm.
and how that affect humans. But I mean, there's the earth there is so different too. Like you said, like the energy coming out of the earth is very, very different than it is here in North America, and just to circle this back to how we're disconnected from the body, right? American culture, when you greet somebody, you extend your hand out and you shake their hand. It's like I'm at a distance from you, like, and in Latin cultures, it's hi, I hug you, I kiss your cheek. Like they're so much more graceful and comfortable in and with their body,
That's
so.
very true. Yeah.
Mhm, mhm.
But at least we shake each other's hands.
Right, right. I know.
I hug everybody, so I'm
I
a
do
hugger.
too. I do too.
Well, Bree, can you share your website and how people can get in touch with you if they'd like to work with you?
Yeah, absolutely. My website's Healing with Bree, BRI. Um, I see people over Zoom and in person. So I'm located here in beautiful, lovely Southern California. For this next bit of time, I'm actually moving to Costa Rica.
Oh,
So
wow.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So yeah, so in a year or so I'll be pretty much solely online, but yeah.
Well, thank you, Bree. I know a lot of this is difficult to talk about, but I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your experience. And I'm hoping somebody out there is going to hear this and try some of these things, or maybe have an aha moment about their own experience, especially if
Mhm.
they've had multiple surgeries as a child.
Mhm.
Thank you so much for sharing your story.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's an honor. And, a lot of people don't know about medical surgical trauma and how it affects them. I mean, I didn't even know. So, I think it's important for those who really are wanting to heal. I think people who are searching and seeking, they deserve to find this information. So, thank you for having me.
Thank you for being on the show.
Yeah.